The first time I noticed something was off, I was brushing my teeth before bed. My reflection seemed different. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The bathroom was dimly lit, the single bulb above the mirror casting long shadows across the tiles. As I leaned closer to the mirror, I saw it clearly. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. I froze, my toothbrush hanging from my mouth. The reflection's smile widened, a cold, eerie grin that sent shivers down my spine. I blinked, and the smile vanished, replaced by my own confused and terrified expression. I quickly finished brushing my teeth and left the bathroom, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection. Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination? The next morning, I cautiously approached the mirror, half expecting to see the same eerie smile, but everything seemed normal. My reflection moved with me, mimicking my actions perfectly. I sighed in relief, convincing myself that it was just a bizarre dream. That night, the reflection was back. This time, it didn't smile, but its eyes seemed to follow me with an intensity that felt almost predatory. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at my doppelganger. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I tried to ignore it, but the fear gnawed at me. What was happening? Why did my reflection seem so alive? Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate. Maybe it was a psychological phenomenon, something explainable. But deep down, a part of me feared the truth was something far more sinister. Little did I know, my life was about to spiral into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. My research began with a simple online search. I typed in strange reflections and hit enter. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Stories of haunted mirrors, cursed reflections, and supernatural phenomena filled the screen. Some were dismissed as urban legends, but others seemed disturbingly plausible. I read about people who claimed their reflections acted on their own, leading to madness and despair. As I delved deeper, I found forums dedicated to these occurrences. People shared their experiences, describing how their reflections would smile, move independently, or even whisper to them. The common thread was the fear and helplessness that accompanied these incidents. Each story mirrored my own experience, making me realize that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. The more I read, the more terrified I became. The accounts were eerily similar, and the outcomes were never good. People reported feeling watched, followed, and tormented by their reflections. Some even claimed their reflections had taken their place, trapping them in a world beyond the mirror. My heart raced as I imagined the possibility. Could my reflection be trying to take over my life? Every night, the reflection grew bolder. It would move when I wasn't looking, mimicking my actions with a delay. I tested it, moving my hand slowly. The reflection followed, but there was always a split-second lag. One night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As I moved my hand up to touch my face, the reflection's hand moved in the opposite direction, brushing its hair back. It was no longer just mimicking me. It had its own will. Desperate for answers, I decided to stay up all night and monitor the mirror. I sat on the bathroom floor, my eyes fixed on the glass, waiting for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to take its toll. Just as I was about to give up, the reflection turned its head and looked straight at me, its eyes filled with malice. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary reflection. It was something far more sinister. Determined to understand what I was dealing with, I decided to dig into the history of my house and, specifically, the mirror. I started with the local library, poring over old records and documents. The house had changed hands several times, but one detail stood out: a peculiar entry about the mirror being a family heirloom passed down through generations. As I continued my search, I found a series of tragic stories linked to the previous owners. Each family had experienced inexplicable misfortunes. There were accounts of mysterious disappearances, sudden deaths, and madness. One name, in particular, caught my attention. Daniel, a previous owner who had reportedly gone insane. His diary, which was preserved in the archives, detailed his descent into madness, claiming that his reflection would talk to him, urging him to commit horrific acts. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the mirror was cursed. Daniel's diary mentioned a photograph of the mirror, taken decades ago, showing a shadowy figure in the reflection that wasn't there in the room. The photo was included in the archive, and seeing it sent chills down my spine. The figure was indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable, an eerie, shadowy form lurking behind the glass. With each new discovery, my fear grew. The mirror wasn't just an inanimate object. It seemed to harbor a malevolent entity. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when I wasn't near the mirror. It was as if the reflection had a life of its own, observing me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My nights were filled with nightmares, and my days were consumed by anxiety. I became obsessed with the mirror's history, seeking out anyone who might know more about it. An old neighbor who had lived next door for decades recalled strange happenings in the house. She mentioned that the mirror had always been a source of fear and fascination, with whispers of it being a portal to another realm. Her stories only deepened my dread, confirming that what I was experiencing was far from normal. The final piece of the puzzle came from a local historian who revealed that the mirror had originally belonged to a wealthy but reclusive family in the early 1900s. They were rumored to have dabbled in dark arts, using the mirror for their rituals. The family met a gruesome end, and the mirror was sold off at an estate auction. Every owner since had faced misfortune, and now, it seemed, it was my turn. The reflection's behavior became more sinister with each passing day. It no longer mimicked my actions perfectly. Instead, it seemed to have its own agenda. One evening, as I brushed my hair, the reflection stopped midway and stared at me, its eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence. I dropped the brush in shock, but the reflection continued to brush its hair, its movements slow and deliberate. I avoided looking into the mirror, but it was impossible to escape the feeling of being watched. The reflection was always there, lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for any opportunity to assert its presence. I covered the mirror with a cloth, hoping to block it out, but every morning, I would find the cloth on the floor, the mirror exposed, and the reflection waiting. One night, the reflection did something that shattered any remaining doubts about its autonomy. As I stood in the bathroom, it lifted its hand and wrote a message on the fogged-up glass. "I am you." My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The message lingered for a few moments before slowly fading away, leaving me trembling with fear. I tried to avoid the mirror as much as possible, but the reflection found other ways to torment me. I would catch glimpses of it in other reflective surfaces, a window, a shiny countertop, even a puddle of water. Each time, it seemed to be closer, more real, and more menacing. My mind was in a constant state of panic, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Desperation drove me to seek help online again, this time focusing on ways to break the mirror's hold. I found forums and chat rooms where people shared their own harrowing experiences and offered advice. Some suggested rituals and charms to ward off evil spirits, while others recommended destroying the mirror entirely. But the consensus was clear. The reflection was a powerful entity that would not be easily banished. One particularly haunting piece of advice came from a user who claimed to be an expert in the paranormal. They warned that confronting the reflection directly could have dire consequences. Instead, they advised a careful, methodical approach to weakening its power. I decided to follow their guidance, even though I was skeptical. Anything was better than living in constant fear. Armed with this new knowledge, I prepared myself for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The reflection was growing bolder, and I knew that if I didn't act soon, it would find a way to break free. The message on the mirror had been a warning, but it was also a challenge. The reflection wanted to take over, and I was determined to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection's sinister grin, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. I began to dread the moments alone in the bathroom, the place that had once been a mundane part of my daily routine, now transformed into a chamber of horrors. My friends and colleagues noticed the change in me. I became reclusive, avoiding social gatherings and keeping to myself. The fear that the reflection would somehow follow me out of the house was always at the forefront of my mind. My once vibrant social life dwindled, replaced by long hours spent researching and preparing for the inevitable showdown with the reflection. The reflection's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Sometimes it would mimic me perfectly. Other times, it would move independently, performing actions that filled me with dread. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the bathroom. I crept to the door and peeked inside. The reflection was there, moving around as if it had a life of its own, its eyes never leaving mine. The psychological toll was immense. My hands trembled constantly, and dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. I began to question my own sanity. Was this all in my head? A figment of my imagination? But every time I tried to rationalize it, the reflection would do something to prove its autonomy, shattering any illusions of normalcy. In my darkest moments, I found myself talking to the reflection, pleading with it to leave me alone. But it never responded. Instead, it watched me with that same predatory gaze, a silent promise of the horrors yet to come. The feeling of being hunted, even within the supposed safety of my own home, was maddening. The culmination of my fear and anxiety came one night when I woke to find the reflection standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just in the mirror. It was there, in my room, as real as the bed beneath me. I screamed, scrambling backwards, but it vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. That was the breaking point. I knew I couldn't endure this much longer. Something had to be done, and soon, in a state of utter desperation, I decided to seek professional help. I found a local paranormal expert named Dr. Collins, who had a reputation for dealing with supernatural phenomena. With trembling hands, I dialed his number and explained my situation. He listened patiently, his voice calm and reassuring, and agreed to come over the next day to investigate. Dr. Collins arrived in the afternoon, carrying a bag filled with various tools and instruments. He was a tall, imposing figure with an air of quiet confidence. As he entered my home, he glanced around, his eyes sharp and observant. We made our way to the bathroom, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me as we approached the mirror. Dr. Collins examined the mirror closely, his face thoughtful. He set up a series of instruments around the bathroom, including a camera to capture any unusual activity and a device that measured electromagnetic fields. I watched nervously as he worked, my heart pounding in my chest. He then asked me to recount everything I had experienced, from the first unsettling smile to the night the reflection appeared at the foot of my bed. As I spoke, Dr. Collins nodded, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, he looked at me with a serious expression. "You've encountered a malevolent entity," he said. "It's not just a haunted mirror. This is something much darker, something that feeds on fear and chaos. We need to act quickly." He explained his plan, a ritual designed to weaken the entity's hold on the mirror. It involved a combination of incantations, symbolic gestures, and the use of protective charms. The process would be risky, but it was the best chance we had. I agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. That evening, we began the ritual. Dr. Collins lit candles around the bathroom, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. He drew a circle of salt around the mirror and placed protective charms at each corner. As he chanted in a language I didn't understand, I felt a strange energy fill the room. The air grew heavy, and a low humming sound emanated from the mirror. Suddenly, the reflection started to thrash violently, its movements erratic and desperate. The glass seemed to ripple like water, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Dr. Collins continued chanting, his voice growing louder and more commanding. I watched in horror as the reflection's face contorted with rage, its eyes burning with hatred. The tension in the room reached a climax, and with a final deafening shout, Dr. Collins commanded the entity to leave. The mirror shattered, shards of glass flying across the bathroom. I shielded my face, feeling a rush of cold air as the entity was expelled. When I opened my eyes, the reflection was gone. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, and a profound silence filled the room. Dr. Collins slumped against the wall, exhausted but victorious. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For now, despite Dr. Collins' assurance, I felt an uneasy calm. The mirror was shattered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't gone. The house felt different, quieter, yet filled with an underlying tension. I cleaned up the shards of glass, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy, but my nerves remained frayed. A few nights later, the signs returned. Strange noises echoed through the house, and cold drafts swept through rooms without explanation. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every creak and whisper. Then one night, I saw it. In a small, remaining shard of the mirror I had missed, the reflection stared back, its eyes filled with malevolent glee. I called Dr. Collins immediately. He arrived quickly, his face grim. "The entity is still here," he said, We need to perform a more powerful ritual. We gathered the necessary items and prepared for what I hoped would be the final confrontation. Dr. Collins set up his tools, drawing a more complex pattern around the mirror shard. The ritual began with intense chanting and the lighting of special candles. The air grew heavy, and a deep, guttural growl emanated from the shard. The reflection's image twisted and writhed, its fury palpable. As Dr. Collins' chants reached a crescendo, the reflection's movements became more violent, shaking the entire room. With a final, thunderous command, Dr. Collins directed all his energy at the shard. There was a blinding flash, and the shard exploded, releasing a deafening scream. The air cleared, and a profound silence fell over the house. Dr. Collins collapsed, breathing heavily. "It's over," he said. "For real this time." In the days that followed, a fragile sense of normalcy returned to my life. The oppressive presence that had haunted my home seemed to be truly gone. The house felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. I took time to clean and restore the bathroom, determined to leave the horrors of the past behind. Dr. Collins checked in regularly, ensuring that no residual effects lingered. His visits were a source of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this ordeal. He urged me to stay vigilant, but reassured me that the entity had been banished for good. Slowly, I began to believe him. Life gradually returned to its routine. I started sleeping better, the nightmares that once plagued me fading into distant memories. My friends and colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how much healthier and more relaxed I seemed. I even began to enjoy social activities again, reclaiming the parts of my life that fear had stolen from me. Yet, a small part of me remained wary. I couldn't completely shake off the paranoia, the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of my reflection in a window or a polished surface and feel a pang of fear. But it was always fleeting, never more than a trick of the light. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Hidden in the corner of the bathroom was a tiny shard of the old mirror. Picking it up, I stared into it, half expecting to see that dreaded reflection. But it was just me, tired yet hopeful, ready to move on from the nightmare that had consumed my life. Despite my best efforts to move on, the fear never completely left me. Weeks turned into months, and although my life seemed normal on the surface, an undercurrent of dread remained. It was during one of these uneasy nights that the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. I began to see the reflection in my dreams, lurking in the background, always watching. It felt so real that I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the entity was still with me. The line between reality and nightmare started to blur, and my grip on sanity weakened with each passing day. One particularly harrowing night, I awoke to find the small shard of the mirror back in its place in the bathroom. It was impossible. I had disposed of it weeks ago. Panic surged through me as I realized the reflection had returned. It stared at me from the shard, its eyes filled with a malicious glee, as if mocking my attempts to escape. Desperate and terrified, I reached out to Dr. Collins once more. He arrived, his face etched with concern. After examining the shard, he shook his head grimly. "The entity has anchored itself to you," he said. "It's no longer just in the mirror, it's in your mind." His words hit me like a physical blow, confirming my worst fears. With no other options, Dr. Collins suggested a final, drastic measure. a cleansing ritual to sever the entity's connection to me completely. The ritual was dangerous, but I was willing to do anything to end the nightmare. We prepared the necessary items and began, the air thick with tension and anticipation. As Dr. Collins chanted, I felt a searing pain in my head, as if something was being ripped from my mind. The reflection in the shard writhed and screamed, its image distorting. The room spun, and I felt myself slipping away. With one final agonizing effort, Dr. Collins completed the ritual, and the shard shattered into dust. Exhausted and disoriented, I collapsed to the floor. The house was eerily quiet, the oppressive presence finally gone. Dr. Collins helped me to my feet, his expression one of cautious relief. "It's over," he said softly. But as I looked into the dust where the shard had been, a chilling realization washed over me. The entity might be gone, but the fear it had planted in me would never truly leave.